Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Bibbity Bobbity Books. My name is Ellie and this is going to be my top 10 list of 2023. This has got to be my favourite video to watch other people do. I love hearing people talking about their favourite books, and I also really love filming it because it's so fun gushing about my favourites, and I'm so excited to talk to you about these 10 books. I would say my reading year last year was pretty average. I probably had about an equal number of books that I really enjoyed and other books that I just thought were okay. So yeah, a fairly average year for me, but that being said, I do have 10 books to share with you today that I think are just gems and I love them with my whole heart and soul, so I'm so excited to talk to you about them. So let's get cracking. These are going to be in no particular order, and just to clarify, these are books that I just happened to read in the year of 2023. They're not books that came out necessarily in 2023, if that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to kick this list off with The Last Quintessa by Donna Barbara Higuera. This is actually a sci-fi middle grade, and I'm really surprised that a middle grade has made it onto this top 10 list. I mean, I do really enjoy middle grade as a genre. When I'm in the mood, I find it a really fun way to escape adult life and to just smash through some books nice and quickly if I don't want something that I really have to sort of pay a lot of focus and attention to, if that makes sense. But I don't normally expect to fall in love with a middle grade as much as I fell in love with this one, and I implore you to go and check out this book even if you don't normally read middle grade, because I think that it definitely will resonate with a much wider audience. So this book is set in the future when Earth is destroyed by a comet. And our main character Petra is a young girl who is among the lucky few who has been chosen to be saved, and her family board this spacecraft and get put into stasis, and they are essentially travelling away from planet Earth before it gets hit by the comet, so they can go to this distant planet where they can start up a new society and continue on the human race. And only a select few have been chosen. It's those who have a particular gift. So for example, her parents are amazing biologists, so it's a group of scientists and politicians and people who can bring a skill to this new society, and they board the ship, they go into stasis, and the ship is actually manned by other people whose sole purpose is to ensure that those in stasis reach their destination. So they are looking after the people who are in stasis, they're manning the spacecraft, and they will live out the rest of their days in space because it's going to be hundreds of years before it reaches its final destination. And something goes wrong, and Petra actually ends up waking up before the ship reaches its destination, and she quickly finds out that there's something strange going on. Other people don't seem to have any memories of their history or their past, and she basically uncovers this big conspiracy that's going on, and I don't want to say any more than that because I don't want to give anything away. But this is such a fantastic story. Not only is it really gripping from start to end, it's also incredibly emotive and deals with some really interesting themes of family, of grief, of hope. And what I loved about our main character is that she really wants to be a storyteller like her grandmother, and she uses the gift of storytelling to inspire those around her and to provide comfort to those who are in a pretty dire situation. And it's such a celebration of storytelling, and I really like the fact that it discusses how it's important to hold on to our history to shape our future, and how important it is to hold on to our memories and to think about what makes us us, what makes us human. And it's just such a beautiful tale, and I just loved it so much. There were several moments where I teared up, and it's fantastic. Please go read it. Okay, the next book is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. This is so fun. I went into this book expecting to have a fun time because I'm a huge fan of the movie. I'm sure you probably don't need me to talk about what this is about because we're all familiar with the movie franchise, but I wasn't expecting to end up having this on my favourites list. This was so good. I really enjoyed how Michael Crichton made a really far-fetched situation feel quite real and grounded, because he used a lot of science talk, a lot of mathematics and philosophy within this book to make it feel like a real life situation. And I just loved that. It's quite a nerdy book, I would say, because of that, if that makes sense. There are things like diagrams in here and tables and graphs. Can you see that as an example? But this is so fun. It had a lot of the iconic scenes from the movie in here, but it also had quite a lot of differences as well. So it really kept me on my toes from beginning to end. I really enjoyed how gory it was. It was actually surprisingly dark. I would say much darker than the movie. I'm guessing because they wanted the movie to appeal to a family audience, whereas this one is actually quite grisly and is very action-packed. It'll have you turning the pages. I even love the slightly over-the-top characters in here, and it's just such a fun time. So if you haven't tried the book, definitely recommend. Okay, so next up we have Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. So this is a book that has received a lot of hype, I would say, on BookTube and BookTok, and I think for good reason, because I really enjoyed this short novel. This I would describe as a literary horror, and it's quite a bizarre one. I don't think it's going to appeal to everyone because it is a little bit niche, but it's essentially a deep dive into a relationship between two people. So it's looking at two people who are struggling, and one member of the relationship is a marine biologist, and she basically goes on this deep sea mission that ends in catastrophe, and when she comes back she has been changed, and we're looking at how what happened to her is affecting her relationship with her wife. And it's split between two points of view, so you get to see the point of view of each member of the relationship, and it's so melancholic and emotive. It definitely deals with themes of grief and loss, and also plays on our collective fears of the deep sea and losing touch with reality. And it also discusses things like, when is it appropriate to grieve for someone? Is it more painful to hold on or to let go? And I feel like the star of the show is the writing and the characters, because they feel very realistic to me in that they're both flawed and they don't necessarily, you know, always do the right thing, and you really feel like you hear them, and their voice is very clear in this story, if that makes sense. It's a very intimate novel because of that. I feel like the ending was incredibly poignant and moving. It definitely had me tearing up, and it also made me question as well, you know, what would I do in this situation, and you know, what lengths would I go to protect someone that I love. And yeah, I just loved it. If you enjoy stories that look at relationships, and if you don't mind something that's quite melancholic, then I would recommend this one. It does also have some horror moments and some horror themes woven in there, but I would say the focus is much more on this relationship and this idea of love and loss. Okay, next up we have The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. This is a standalone adult fantasy, and I just love this one so much. This is a story that follows two main perspectives. We follow a mother called Mizaki and her son Mamoru, and we flip between their different perspectives, and it's set on a peninsula called the Sword of Kaigen, and the people who live on this peninsula have quite a old-fashioned culture, I would say. It's a military setting, so the idea is that the men who are from this place get trained up to be the most fearsome warriors, and the women are expected to be housewives and to produce men to be in the army. So the son, Mamoru, has grown up his whole life idolizing war and kind of glamorizing it, and really wanting to become a fierce warrior like his ancestors. And then his eyes are opened when war does actually arrive at the Sword of Kaigen, and he is, you know, witnessing the true horrors of war. And it's just so fascinating seeing his perspective. And I also love the perspective of his mum. His mum actually had the opportunity to leave the Sword of Kaigen when she was younger and to experience other cultures, and she developed some skills herself, including sword fighting, but she kind of pushed all that away and moved that aside because she wanted to conform to her family's expectations and her society's expectations. So she kind of put away her sword so that she could become this housewife that everyone expected her to be. But then when war arrives, we see that she is drawn back to her sword fighting ways, and we watch the lengths that she will go to protect her family, and she is just such a fierce female character. I loved her perspective. I loved how flawed she was, how inconsistent she was at times. She just felt very real, and it was so fun at flipping between the two perspectives, and such a creative setting as well. And I really enjoyed the action scenes in here, and I'm not an action scenes fan. I tend to glaze over a little bit when you get the fight scenes, but in this one I loved it. I loved the mix of sword fighting and magic elements, and I just couldn't put it down. So highly recommend this one if you enjoy the sound of any of that. Okay, so next we have a horror book. This is Revelator by Daryl Gregory. This is a book that I feel like I haven't heard that many people talking about, and it's a tragedy because let me tell you, this book is fantastic. It is so unique and just so entertaining and so gripping. This is a historical horror novel, so it's set in the 1930s, and it flips between two different timelines. So we're following the same girl, who's a girl called Stella, and we see her when she's a 9-year-old, when she's been given up by her family to go and live with her grandmother in this reclusive town in the backwoods of Tennessee. And then we also follow her when she's a grown woman and she's working as a bootlegger. And it's so interesting because we find out that she was obviously delivered to this remote town in the woods, and her family actually worship this god that lives in the mountain. And we watch as she is kind of groomed to become this, they call it the Revelator, so it's someone who can go into the mountain and commune with this god. And it's just so weird and so creepy and unsettling and interesting watching her kind of go through this experience as a young girl and to be manipulated into becoming this character. And there's a lot of talk about religion and faith and abuse and sexism, and it's so interesting. And then we also get the perspective of her when she is older and she's a woman, so you see that she's obviously moved away from that town as an older lady and she's running this business as a bootlegger. But she gets called back to her childhood home when her grandmother dies, and she finds out that this other young girl, I think it's her cousin, is now being trained up to be the new Revelator, and she is, I guess, trying to protect her from that. So hard to talk about because I don't want to give away any spoilers, but I loved the main character in this book. She is so easy to root for. She's incredibly determined, and it's so interesting seeing her different perspectives because obviously when she's a 9-year-old, she is pretty naive and she is being manipulated by those around her, and so she has a very different point of view. So when she is older, and flipping between the two timelines just keeps you racing through the page, and it just made it such a quick and easy read to get through because you're constantly trying to figure out what's going on, and I just loved it. If you enjoy weird horror, I highly recommend this one. Okay, so next up we have Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor. This is the second book in my favourite, I think, or at least one of my favourite fantasy series ever. That's high praises indeed. I am not surprised that this is on my favourites list, but I don't know why I put off reading this book for so long. I think it's because I love the first book in this duology, Strange the Dreamer, so much, and I was really terrified that I wouldn't like the ending to this little duology and that I would be disappointed, but I shouldn't have worried because I absolutely fell back into this story. I loved sinking back into Laini Taylor's writing because she has the most gorgeous lyrical prose, and I just loved being back with these characters and in this world, and I absolutely flew through this book and absolutely loved it. If you've not heard of this series before, it's actually a young adult fantasy series, but I would say that it reads kind of like an adult book. The first one follows our main character Laszlo Strange, who is an orphan of war, and he is raised in a monastery, and he has always been incredibly interested in stories, in particular the story of this mythical lost city which is known as Weep. So no one can actually remember the name of this city. Whenever they try to recall anything about it, they just hear the word Weep. And Laszlo Strange has always been drawn to this story, and one day he runs an errand that takes him to a library and he decides to never leave. So he just stays in the library, becomes a librarian by fault, I guess, and learns more and more about this mythical city. And then one day he's presented with this opportunity to travel across the world to try and locate this city with a group of warriors, I think it is. And so he travels across the world to go and find this city, and that's all I'm going to say. It is so lyrical, so beautifully written, such vivid and beautiful scenes within this story. A lot of the magical elements involve dreams, and so you get a lot of beautiful descriptions of vivid dreams and just descriptions of this mythical city of Weep are so beautiful, and it just made me really want to go there myself. And I also really love that this story has a beautiful romance in it too, and I'm not talking a steamy romance, I'm talking a innocent, beautiful, quiet romance between two characters who have never had the opportunity to love before, and it's just so gorgeous seeing the two of them learn to love each other. And my goodness, I just love this series so much. It's incredibly moving, so do be prepared for having your heart broken if you read this book, because there are definitely moments that had me welling up. It's quite emotional at times, but it's also just so beautiful and atmospheric. Okay, so next up we have a non-fiction book, and this is The Wager, written by David Gran. So this is a non-fiction book about a vessel, a British vessel called The Wager, which set sail in, I think it's 1761, and it was in pursuit of this Spanish galleon, which was essentially this Spanish ship that was full of loads of treasure. And it ended up getting shipwrecked off the coast of Patagonia, and the survivors of this shipwreck had to survive for months on this desolate island, and eventually they patched together this rickety, dodgy raft and sailed for, I think it's 100 days or something ridiculous, across storm-wrecked seas until they finally arrived at Brazil. And it is absolutely ridiculous what these people went through, and I just really enjoyed hearing different sides to the story as well, because different people tell different tales, because there was definitely a question of whether or not there was a mutiny that happened. There's different people accusing others of certain things. There may or may not have been people who resorted to cannibalism and other crimes like murder, and it's fascinating kind of hearing different sides of the story and coming to your own conclusions about what might have gone down. And I also just loved finding out about what life was like in those days as a seafaring person, you know, even the day-to-day practicalities of living on and running a ship are ridiculous. Like, the living conditions were absolutely outrageous. They had to face famine, disease, you know, even things like the danger of going up to the mast, you know, to unfold the sails, like literally climbing up so high without any kind of protection during stormy seas. Like, it's crazy. Even just the mundane daily tasks of working on a ship are insane. And then add on top of that the fact that it was shipwrecked and they had to survive on a desolate island. And it's just, it really is amazing the things that humans can survive and it was absolutely fascinating finding out about all of it, and it's presented in such an engaging way. You know, sometimes I feel like non-fiction books can read quite dry, whereas this one didn't read dry at all. It had me turning the pages and I was just absolutely drawn in from the very first page. Okay, so the next book is A Headful of Ghosts, written by Paul Tremblay. This is an adult horror book and I loved this one. This was so good. This is a story about a family who are going through a really tough situation when their eldest daughter, who is I think she's like 14-year-old daughter Marjorie, ends up showing signs of acute schizophrenia. And they do everything they can in their power to help her, but going to a doctor and seeking medical help doesn't seem to be doing anything, and the family are under a lot of financial strain because their father has lost his job, and you know, they're at wit's end. They don't know what else they can do for their daughter, and so they decide to approach a Catholic priest, and the Catholic priest feels like their daughter is actually being possessed by a demon, and he strongly believes that the best way to help her is to perform an exorcism. And he also reaches out to this TV company who are wanting to film this new hit TV show which is called The Possession, and it's like a reality TV show, and because the family are under financial pressure they decide to take up this offer and they become the unwitting stars of this TV show, which basically films their daily life and what it's like to live with someone who is going through this issue or who is possessed by a demon. And it's so intense, and what I loved about this story is that it's retrospective, so it's actually told from the perspective of the youngest daughter in this family, who was only 8 at the time, and now she is a much older woman and she's being interviewed and she's basically recalling what it was like living during this time when her older sister was having these challenging behaviours and when she was basically being filmed the whole time by this TV company. And it's insane what this family goes through, and it's made even more horrific by the fact that we are being told it through the eyes of an 8-year-old who doesn't even understand really what's going on, and you're never quite sure how much of what she is saying is fact and how much of it might be elaborated or misremembered. And it's so interesting. Definitely has themes of an unreliable narrator, and what I loved about this is you also get segments which are presented as a blog. So it's a blogger who's actually analysing the TV show. So not only are we getting the perspective of this 8-year-old and her, you know, first-hand experiences of what it was like to live through this time, you're also getting the perspective of a blogger who is analysing the actual TV show and who is talking about things like, you know, the choices that were made by the producers to make this TV show better, and how they might have painted certain characters in a certain light, or how they might have edited the footage to exaggerate certain things. And so basically Paul Tremblay has taken what at its core is a fairly simple possession type horror story, but has looked at it from a really unique perspective, and it keeps you guessing, and the whole time you are always wondering what is fact and what is fiction, and it is honestly truly horrific, and you really feel like you get to know this family, and it's so interesting watching each member of the family's different reaction to this situation that they're in and how they respond to the stresses of this situation, and you can't help but feel for this family, and it's just truly tragic what ends up happening to them. So yeah, it's so intense and I absolutely loved it. Okay, so next up we have another horror, and this is You Let Me In by Camilla Bruce. This is such a weird book. I definitely don't think this is going to be for everybody, but I loved it. This is a very dark, fantastical, eerie story, and it centres on the main character, who is a woman called Cassandra, and she went missing like a year prior and has been presumed dead, and her nephew and niece turn up at her house to go through her things, and they find this letter that's addressed to them, and the letter basically says that they can have everything that Cassandra owned if they read her letter from beginning to end. And the letter is basically detailing Cassandra's experiences, And you find out that Cassandra had an incredibly traumatic life. She was accused of murdering her husband. She also lost her brother in a murder-suicide. And it's so fascinating hearing her truth. So we find out that she saw this fantastical creature. She's been connected to this fae-like being since she was a young girl. And this fae creature kind of has fed on her whole life, and she has this really interesting relationship with them. And a lot of the actions that she did and the ways that she behaved to her were because she was trying to protect those around her from this fae creature and from this dark fae world which she has a connection to. And throughout the whole story, you're never entirely sure whether this is actually true or whether she has created this world and has changed her memories in order to understand what happened to her when she was a child, and to kind of cope with her childhood trauma. It's so fascinating. It's incredibly unsettling, incredibly disturbing, huge trigger warnings, as with a lot of these books actually. Please always check out trigger warnings before you go into any stories if you're sensitive to any topics. But it was so interestingly done, and I just loved the dark fae side to this story. It reminded me a little bit of Pan's Labyrinth. So if you've watched that movie, I feel like you might want to give this one a try, because it definitely had similar imagery in it and a similar themes, in that you've got a young girl who is kind of having access to this dark fae world and you're never quite sure what's real and what's fiction. Similar to the last book really. Maybe I just like books where you're never quite sure what's true and what's not. Don't know what that says about me, but yeah, I just love this one. If you enjoy a dark fairy tale type story and you're a fan of horror and you don't mind things that are incredibly disturbing, then maybe give this one a try. Okay, and the last book on this list is Krampus, the Yule Lord, written by Brom. I buddy read this book with my friend John right at the end of the year, and I'm very pleased to put this on my top 10 list. I really enjoyed this one. It wasn't really what I was expecting, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So in this story, we're following a man called Jesse, who basically witnesses Santa's sleigh getting attacked by these demon-like creatures. And during this kerfuffle, Santa's sack ends up falling into his possession. And he finds out that this is a magical sack, and he can pull out any toy that he thinks of from this sack. And this is such a good thing for him, because he is very much down on his luck. He hasn't had any luck with his musical career. He's, you know, not got a lot of financial means. He's recently split from his wife, who has left him for a wealthier man, so he doesn't really see his daughter very often, and he sees this as a great opportunity to prove himself as a good father and to be able to actually provide for his daughter this Christmas. But it turns out he's not the only one who's after Santa's sack, and he ends up getting caught in this feud between Santa Claus and Krampus. And it's so interesting because Brom weaves in Norse mythology to this story. So it turns out that Krampus is actually related to Loki, the trickster god, and it's so interesting seeing those elements come through into this story. This is definitely one of those books where you can kind of peel away the layers and see that Brom is using the subject to discuss bigger things. So for example, a main theme for me in this story is old versus new. So Krampus very much represents the old ways, whereas Santa Claus represents a more modern consumerist type society. And it's interesting seeing kind of the to and fro between those two characters and those two themes. It is very dark though. It's set during a modern time, but there is a lot of graphic violence in this story, so please go into this one carefully. Our main character Jesse ends up getting mixed up with this crime gang and ends up in a feud with a very dangerous man, and it does get quite bloody, it does get quite violent, so please be warned of that one. But this is the perfect book for you if you want something that is fitting for a Christmassy period, because it's set obviously during Yuletide, during Christmas. But if you don't want something that's happy and fluffy and all about like giving presents and being with friends and family and loved ones, if you want like a dark Christmas story, I would recommend for you to try this one. And I'm very excited to read more of Brom's work now because I loved his writing style, and I also really enjoy his artwork because he includes pieces of his artwork within the book. For example, you can see here there are some really cool images of the characters from the story, and that to me just adds to the whole experience, and I just really enjoy his style of artwork. So yeah, that is my final book on this list. So those were my 10 favourite books that I read in 2023. I love them all dearly. Please let me know if you read any of these books. Please let me know what your favourite books were that you read last year, and yeah, don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Do subscribe if you want to see some more from me, and I guess I'll see you next time with another video. Bye!